Okay, everybody, we are back here for our final installment of the Arab-Israeli conflict, talking about terrorism versus peace, which really is an unending struggle. But we'll talk about, of course, the negatives of terrorism, but some of the positives and good things that have happened, and some things that can actually give us some hope. So when we look at terrorism, okay, the definition, it's really basic, is the use of violence, intimidation in the pursuit of political aims. And that's when you have these groups that have some type of goal, and we'll talk about the different ones here. And they use violence to achieve them. And typically, and something I want you to write down and really remember, is that it's typically violence against civilians. Now, in this particular realm, if you will, we really were exposed to terrorism, if you will, for the first time at the Munich Olympics in 1972. Now, I'm not going to get into all of the different terror attacks that have ever happened, but this one was really the one that was first covered by mass media. You had this organization called Black September that wanted to hurt Israel, and what they did is they take over the hotel rooms of a number of Israeli athletes, and they will kill a number of them and take a number of them hostage. And what they wanted to do is have Israel release Arab prisoners. Eventually, they try to get transportation um, out of Munich, which is in Germany. Okay, and they are taken to an airport where authorities try to capture them, and a firefight breaks out, and they kill the rest of the hostage, which now gets up to a total of 11 that are killed. And the impact of this is that whereas they were not successful in their aims of getting these prisoners released, they definitely got the attention of the Israeli government, got the attention of other governments, and you saw the damage, if you will, that was done. And this becomes like the first big moment, if you will, of the 20th century. And this gives you a picture here of the 11 guys that were killed. Just absolutely senseless violence. The Olympics did go on, but they definitely had a cloud over them. But this was just going to be the beginning. Probably the biggest organization from the 70s throughout the 80s was the PLO, or the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Okay, this was a group that was founded by a man by the name of Yasser Arafat, and their basic goal was to destroy Israel and create a Muslim state only where Israel was at that time and where they are now. And what we're going to be seeing, some of the activities that they are going to be doing are going to be bombings and attacks on civilians. And one of the biggest things that they periodically would advocate is called an Intifada, or a throwing off, in which they actually get citizens within Gaza and the West Bank to rise up and try to kind of en masse push out the Israelis from the Gaza Strip or the West Bank. It entails a lot of violence, but the fact of the matter is the Palestinians are very much outgunned here, and they really don't have any opportunities to do it. But they'll continue to do this violence off and on throughout the 70s and throughout the 80s. And here's an example of the Intifada. Just these kids, they burn stuff. You see the kid on the right trying to throw a stone at a tank, which kind of gives you the senselessness of the terrorism in the fact that they're encouraging people to go against tanks with rocks and whatnot, but it also gives you an idea of the desperation and some of the power that these terror groups have over people, that they can convince them to actually do this. Now, another big group that we have to talk about would be Hamas. Hamas was a group that was founded in Palestine in the later time period here, 1988, and they have the same goal as the PLO, and they were really one of the groups that start doing a lot of these suicide bombings that many of you have heard about, people strapping bombs to themselves and blowing things apart. They will also lead an intifada to attack Israeli civilians. But the interesting thing, and we'll be talking about this later in the peace process, in the 1980s and early 90s, they will be a major terrorist organization, yet part of them will split from the major group of Hamas and actually become a political party who today is actually in control of the Palestinian government, which I'll explain later. Probably the guys that are doing the most damage today would be Hezbollah, or what is known as the Party of God. These guys are from Lebanon, and their goal is to simply not only destroy Israel, but get rid of the West. They very much are anti-Britain, anti the United States. You might remember learning last year in 1983, they attacked the barracks of the United States of America that were in Beirut, the capital of Lebanon, and destroyed them, killing over 200 Marines. Um, the issues with them today are they are constantly on attack, and this is the example we've talked about. This is extremist view that if you look at the number of people in the PLO or in Hamas or in Hezbollah or even in Al Qaeda, that these do not make up the bulk of the Muslims, but they have incredible amounts of firepower and they will not be changed from their ideas. It is destroy, destroy, destroy. And here's an example. This was what was left of the Marine barracks in Beirut. You can see the entire center here. If you look at the mouse, is collapsed. Every single window gets blown out. It was just absolutely devastating. And think of, again, when we talk about the Israelis, and some people try to tell them that, it's not that bad or this or that. Well, you've got all these different terror groups that are actually founded to destroy you. I don't know, I would feel pretty unsafe as well. However, throughout all this terrorism period, the interesting part is it is during the period in which you have the rise of the terrorists that you actually have the rise of peace accords. And the first big breakthrough came in 1978 when President Jimmy Carter, he's the guy right here in the middle, was able to get the Prime Minister of Israel, Menachem Begin, that's this guy over here on the right, and the president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, that's this man here on the left, to come together to work on a treaty. Egypt is the largest and most powerful Arabic nation in the Middle East, and the fact that these guys were coming together to actually work on the treaty, in many ways, guys, was actually mind-blowing. And in the end, they make an incredible treaty. Egypt pledges to no longer attack Israel and to actually open up trade. Israel pledges to give back the Sinai Peninsula. If you remember from the last film that you watched, they had taken that over in 1967, so they give that back 11 years later. And the two nations have actually had a really good working relationship for a lot of years now. Unfortunately, this cost Sadat his life. He would be assassinated by another Egyptian just a year later. But the significance of this is one, it showed that the Arabs and the Israelis could work together, and two, that this treaty has held since 1978 and there have been no major conflicts between the two nations. The other big deal, and this was really important because it kind of was the blueprint to what could lead to future success, was the Oslo Peace Accords, which actually started in 1993, and there would be a couple different ones in 93, 94, and 95. They were primarily seen to be finished by Yitzhak Rabin, who is this gentleman on the left, and he is the Prime Minister of Israel. And Yasser Arafat, this is very important. Yasser Arafat is going to change the PLO into the Palestinian Authority. And what that means is that he is changing basically himself from a terrorist to a politician. And I know it sounds crazy, and why would anybody actually be in any type of support of that? But the important thing to understand here is that Arafat was beloved by a lot of Arabs, whether you agree with him or not. And of course, the terrorist things are awful. So Rabin kind of went out on a limb here and felt that if this guy can change over, maybe some of the other more militant groups would actually go with him. And it was fairly successful. What they would do, and as you see here, these men awarded with the Nobel Peace Prize, here's Yitzhak Rabin and here is Yasser Arafat, is that they would actually kind of solidify the borders of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Yitzhak Rabin pledged to stop the settlements of Israelis into the West Bank because, as we said, that was taking away Palestinian land, that they would actually work together. The idea up here, I have up here underlined the partners. The idea of partners is that the Palestinian Authority would get to run their local government in Gaza and the West Bank, okay? And Yasser Arafat would be their elected leader, but they would elect a Congress, if you will, and they would actually have representation with Israel. The ultimate goal was to set up the map, if you will, to eventually have a Palestinian state and an Israeli state. Now, unfortunately, it didn't actually do that. It never put a date on it. It never put specific timeline in order to get stuff done. It just said, hey, if we do this, eventually give the Palestinians some rights, then you give them more rights, you get the settlers out of the West Bank, and then you give it all to them. And that's just never happened. And what really hurt is that just a few years later, Yitzhak Rabin, he gets assassinated by an Israeli. But again, we see the potential and the possibilities here because at times they have made peace treaties. And so when you look at the current concerns today, what's really, really amping things up is first and foremost, Hamas, who was, as I said before, a terrorist group, has also become a political institute. They are the ones in charge of the Palestinian Authority now. The problem is that many terrorists still are hiding out within the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and they still carry out periodic attacks. We recently had attacks this summer in which then the Israelis responded and attacked the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And actually, to protect themselves, if you look on the right here, this is a wall that was built around certain portions of the West Bank. And when you're walling people in, they tend not to respond well to it. And then, so that's the idea that there are still attacks and you still have terrorists in the area and you don't have a strong Palestinian government. And then on the other side, you still have Jewish settlement that was really never stopped, and that it continues to grow today, but then those people are at risk. And so in the end, there's no real easy answer here. As we review it, everybody has claims, everybody wants to stay in the land. The question is how can you one day make a deal that can make each side satisfied to the point where the extremists might be taken out of play? And that's a big thing we're going to talk about in class. All right, so make sure you get your questions down and get some comments, and I will talk to you guys tomorrow.